Council's Climate Connection Higher Education Roundtable series. I'm Susanna Morley, and on behalf of the British Council, I'm delighted to introduce today's event, which is entitled Climate Adaptation and Resilience in ASEAN, From Policy to Practical Application. This is the first in a series of 5 roundtables the British Council is presenting in the lead up to COP26. And the series will be examining the role of higher education in the climate debate. Please visit the Climate Connection website for details of the other events. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you enjoy what will no doubt be a very stimulating and provoking conversation. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Benjamin Horton from the Earth Observatory of Singapore at Nanyang Technological University, who will be our chair today. Over to you, Ben.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Roundtable on Adaptation and Resilience from Policy to Practical Applications. This roundtable over the next couple of hours will explore the roles that universities play in the prevention and relief of climate-induced disasters, with particular emphasis on how research can inform policy. The roundtable is using as a starting point the policy paper that was commissioned by the British High Commission here in Singapore and developed with many partners through the UK COP26 University Network, the Earth Observatory of Singapore here at Nanyang Technological University, for which I'm the director of, the University of Glasgow. You will see a presentation regarding the policy paper in a few minutes, but before that, I'd like to just do a couple of house rules for the audience that are attending today. Regarding any questions that you may have that you want to pose the panelists, can you please do that through the Q&A function? And these questions that you submit through the Q&A function will be visible to all the attendees, including the participants. If there's a particular question that you like, you can use the thumbs up function to try and highlight that to make sure that we deliver this question to the panelists. Because of the high number of attendees, we had over 300 register for this particular event, and bandwidth issues, none of the participants are able to use their camera or audio. You can access live captions by using the closed captions option on your screen. The sessions will be recorded, so you'll be able to access those on the British Council Climate Connection website. And for the participants who submitted questions prior to the event, we've tried to summarise these, and then we'll be asking our panellists a few after the presentation on the policy paper. So to begin, we're really pleased that we have someone from the British High Council, High Commission here in Singapore, to give the opening remarks, and that is Tom Moody. Tom Moody oversees the UK government's climate change and low energy strategy in the ASEAN region. Therefore, he plays a role in mobilising regional policy, development programming and commercial work to deliver Her Majesty's government's priorities in policy areas such as COP26. Tom leads the UK's unique network of climate change and policy advisors, engaging host governments throughout the ASEAN region. So over to you, Tom.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Ben, and to your distinguished panel and the audience for having me. I'm delighted to be with you to open this roundtable about the role of higher education institutions in adaptation and resilience to the climate crisis in Southeast Asia. As Susanna said earlier, this is the first of 5 roundtables within the British Council's Climate Connection initiative. And it's fitting that we start with this subject, adaptation, which is vitally important for the UK's COP26 presidency. And why is that? Well, even as we work steadfastly to come together in Glasgow in just 20 days' time, with a central goal of limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages, we know that even at these levels, there will be extraordinary changes to our way of life, as we're seeing now with just around 1 degrees rise. So adaptation is one of the 4 COP26 priorities for the UK presidency. We want to ensure that around half of the global funding by the richest countries for tackling the climate crisis is directed towards that. And we also want to see all countries communicating clearly in national adaptation plans how they are going to go about taking action and investing. This region is extremely vulnerable to climate change, as we'll hear in a moment from the speakers. It's highly exposed to extreme weather events, with 4 of the top 10 climate risk affected countries in the world in this region. And in many cases, it also has low resilience to those risks, meaning low institutional and government capacity to predict, plan for, and react to climate change and disasters. And a huge challenge in terms of access to the means to protect economies and individuals from the effects of climate-induced disasters. For example, in some parts of this region, there is as little as 1% insurance penetration. So we need to tackle that together. And I'm pleased that the UK government has, through the new COP26 Universities Network, supported the Earth Observatory of Nanyang Technological University of Singapore and the University of Glasgow into looking into these challenges. And we expect to publish their reports along with ones concerning finance, nature and energy next week, just before COP26. Part of today's objective is to crowd in even more academic prowess to help address these sorts of challenges by bringing together higher education institutions like you in the audience. And we hope, as well as helping you plan your own institutional responses to the climate crisis, you'll be able to work with communities on the ground to support them to adapt and be more resilient to climate change in the future. And you can equip your own students with the skills they need to tackle complex climate challenges in the new changing world. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm delighted to support this event and the report, and I hope you enjoy the session. Thanks, Ben, back to you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for setting the stage on how important COP26 is, how important this roundtable is, and the policy report that we're going to discuss throughout this roundtable. So I'd now like to briefly introduce all of our panelists, and I will do this briefly because they have such long and distinguished CVs. We have panelists from 6 different countries here in ASEAN. They are primarily from institutes of higher learning, seeing as this is the focus, but they also include research think tanks and entrepreneurs. The first panelist that I would like to introduce is Professor Fred Tangang. He's a professor of climatology at the Faculty of Science and Technology at the National University of Malaysia, where he currently serves as head of Department of Earth Science and the Environment. Fred has a distinguished career beginning in 1997 with the awarding of his PhD from British Columbia, Canada, regarding the development of a model that understands the El Nino Southern Oscillation. In 2011, he was elected the Fellow of the Academy of Sciences of Malaysia. He served as Vice Chair on an IPCC report and is the review editor on the latest AR6 report. Professor Fred is the lead and coordinates the Codex Southeast Asia program, which is related to the World Climate Research Program. Next, I would like to introduce Assistant Professor Romyen. She is the Center Director for the Southeast Asia Ministry of Education Organization and was a former Vice President of the International Affairs of Mae Fay Leung University in Thailand. Her research regards higher education harmonization and internationalization. On a regional level, she has held many roles, including being the regional expert for the Japan-ASEAN Integration Fund. She has represented women's interests at the United Nations Conference on Sustainability Development, or Rio+20. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Harkunti, who is the chair of the Indonesian Disaster Expert Association and a faculty member at Bandung Institute of Technology. She was the chair of the Working Group 1 of the Intergovernmental Coordination Group on the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System. She, in 2019, won the 2019 Newton Prize Award for her research on increasing the capacity of coastal areas in Indonesia to mitigate and manage disaster strategies. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Mai, a former president of the Vietnam National University in Hanoi, vice chairman of the Vietnam Panel on Climate Change, and director of the university's Lab on Geoenvironment and Climate Change Response. He is a national distinguished expert on earth sciences, climate change, national resources, environmental management, and sustainable development. He has been involved in IPCC reports since 2001. We also have distinguished panelists from outside of academia, such as Quintin Pastrana, an entrepreneur who's focused on promoting renewable energy, literacy, and investment for startups and small and medium enterprises. He is president of WEnergy Power, founder and chair of the award-winning Library Renewal Partnership, and business anchor of ABS-CBN News Channel. He graduated with degrees from Georgetown, Cambridge, and Oxford, and was named among the US ASEAN Business Council's Young Leaders. Next, we have Dr. Kannika, who's currently a senior research fellow at Climate Change Policies and Green Growth Team at the Thailand Development Research Institute. She obtained a PhD in economics from the University of Warwick. Her areas of interest and specialization include climate change, adaptation, waste management, green growth, renewable energy, and the application of behavioral economics in the development of environmental policies. And finally, I'd like to pass on to my co-chair, Romyen Chardot. Dr. Romyen is the Community Engagement Manager at the Earth Observatory of Singapore. The Earth Observatory of Singapore, just to give a very brief introduction, is a research centre of excellence here in Singapore. We have over 150 professors, researchers, and graduate students studying natural disasters and climate. And Romyen's job is to take this scientific information, working with her team, and translate it for stakeholders, be they the general public, media, or policymakers. She works very, very closely with the Singapore's Ministry of Education for creating educational content and developing the curriculum in earth science and climate change. Prior to joining NTU, Dr. Chardot studied at the University of Strasbourg and obtained a PhD from the University of Canterbury. Over to you, Romyen.
Thanks, Ben. So as mentioned by Prof. Horton earlier, during the first part of this session, we will discuss the reports on adaptation and resilience in ASEAN, which was led by the University of Glasgow and the Earth Observatory of Singapore. So this report is one of the 4 reports developed in collaboration with the COP26 Universities Network and the British High Commission to Singapore. And altogether, these reports provide a high-level understanding of the challenges and opportunities arising from climate science and policymaking in the ASEAN region as we seek to transition to a greener economy. So today, this adaptation and resilience in ASEAN report will be presented by its lead author, Professor Fabrice Renaud. So Fabrice Renaud is a professor of environmental risk and community resilience at the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Glasgow, which he joined in 2018. His research interests include vulnerability and risk assessment of social ecological systems exposed to natural hazards. He focuses primarily on hydrometeorological hazards and on understanding the multiple roles ecosystems play in terms of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, particularly from the perspectives of local communities and the broader sustainability agenda. He works predominantly in coastal and deltaic regions of East, South, and Southeast Asia and Europe. Prior to joining the University of Glasgow, Fabrice worked at the United Nations University at the Institute of Environment and Human Security, based in Germany and Indonesia. There, he headed the Environmental, Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services section for over a decade. So Fabrice, thanks a lot for giving this presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lauriane, and I'm going to start sharing my presentation. If you just give me 1 second. So hopefully you should be able to see this. Yeah, okay, great. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on this webinar. As Marianne said, I will give a brief overview of the Adaptation and Resilience in ASEAN report that focuses primarily on managing disaster risks from natural hazards. This was a collaborative work between 17 scientists and experts from the University of Glasgow, from the Earth Observatory of Singapore, NTU, from the University of York, from Heriot-Watt University in Malaysia, from the Vietnam National University Central Institute for Natural Resources and Environmental Studies, and from the ASEAN Secretariat. The report has one diagnostic and 5 key messages, and I will go through these in this presentation. The diagnostic is well known, is that the ASEAN region is one of the most hazardous regions on Earth. We have here a map developed by the Earth Observatory of Singapore that shows seismic intensity in the red shades, the tsunami affected coastlines, volcanic hazards with the yellow triangles, the typhoon and cyclone tracks and intensities in gray shades, and sea level rise with the blue shades. Superimposed on this are major cities, and it is clear that the region is severely affected by these hazards, and that major cities, but also many other types of cities in the region, are exposed to these with potential huge negative consequences to communities, to the economy, and to the environment. The level of exposure of people and the economies to these and other hazards is very important, as shown on this figure, which is taken from the ARMOR, or ASEAN Risk Monitor and Disaster Management Review, to which we also added information on droughts, which is of increasing concern for the region, and the data on droughts come from UNESCO. From this figure, we can see that the highest human and economic exposures are linked to earthquakes, cyclones, and volcanoes. If we take earthquakes as an example, 57% of the ASEAN population is exposed, as is $3.2 trillion of economic exposure. Cyclones have a similar pattern, with 49% of ASEAN population exposed and up to $3.5 trillion economic exposure. Some of these hazards, particularly cyclones, floods, and droughts in particular, will be compounded by the effects of climate change. And the latest IPCC report has highlighted that there would be an increased intensity of cyclones and other elements shown on the left-hand side of the slide, which indicate mean temperature increases of above 1 degree Celsius by the middle of the century, sea level rise by 0.25 meters by mid-century, which is larger and faster than global averages, etc. The consequence of that is that the ASEAN's GDP may be cut by 35% by 2050, according to Swiss Re. And this is because climate change can severely affect agricultural, tourism, and fishing sectors, also have human health effects, and affect labor productivity. It becomes very important to understand the risk landscape a country or locality is facing, and risk assessments are therefore increasingly used for this. For example, here for the ASEAN, a multi-risk assessment was carried out and reported in the Armour report. Here it's a combination of the INFORM Index for Risk Management framework and the ASEAN Risk and Vulnerability Assessment Index framework. You can see from the top left and going clockwise, the exposure, the vulnerability, the lack of coping capacity, and the resultant, which is the multi-hazard risk shown on the figure. The most exposed country is the Philippines. The highest vulnerability is found in Myanmar. The lowest coping capacities are Myanmar, Cambodia, and now PDR. And overall, the most at-risk countries are Myanmar and the Philippines. Singapore and Brunei Darussalam are the least at risk in this assessment. This assessment is in broad agreement with the Climate Risk Index, which computes the impacts of extreme weather events, with Myanmar and the Philippines ranked as the two most at risk in the region, and Singapore and Brunei Darussalam the least at risk in the region. There is also a broad agreement with the World Risk Index, which is also a well-known risk index, with one exception where Brunei Darussalam, for example, is classified as very high risk in that assessment, whereas here it is classified as very low risk. And it would be interesting to find out why these discrepancies are, because this obviously has policy implication. These assessments are useful and can help us identify the root causes of risk, which we can capture through the exposure to vulnerability and the lack of coping capacities. However, for this, subnational analysis should be carried out to enable implementing targeted risk reduction measures and developing more specific understandings of these root causes. One of the limitations is data availability at the right spatial resolution, and strategies should be considered to collect such data. This would then allow us to focus more closely on the circumstances, the needs, and the priorities of people who are poor or marginalized, or who could become poor and marginalized due to the effects of climate stresses and other types of crises. This would also allow us to inform disaster preparedness planning and activities, which is one of the priorities for action of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, or SFDR. Preparedness is relevant to all the SFDR targets, which the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, or ADMER, plans to address in its 2021-2025 work plan. These targets include reduction of global disaster mortality, reduction of direct economic losses, also the increase of availability and access to multi-hazard early warning system, just naming 3 of them. Although most of the messages from the report link directly or indirectly to preparedness, one aspect is that we need to emphasize that early warning systems should be placed at high-risk regions to closely monitor the regions and take immediate actions prior to disasters manifesting themselves. In terms of disaster risk reduction measures, it would be imperative to systematically consider approaches such as nature-based solutions or engineered solutions, or a combination of both, which are known as hybrid solutions. There is still a tendency for engineered infrastructure to be considered systematically and first, with the opportunity of alternative measures such as nature-based solutions or hybrid solutions not systematically explored. And it's important to note that when NBS, so nature-based solutions such as ecosystem-based adaptations or ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, can provide the same kind of risk reduction levels than an engineering solution would, it's important to factor in the fact that they can also provide many other ecosystem services which could prove highly beneficial to communities. Efforts should therefore be made to consider them along business as usual approaches, which are traditionally engineering solutions, but recognizing that no single solution, whichever it is a panacea to solving the disaster risk reduction problem. Finally, finance is an important part of disaster risk management, and most disaster losses in the region are uninsured, therefore reducing the coping capacity of social and economic system. The insured losses at around 10% for the region. Mechanisms to address this therefore need to be boosted, and the ASEAN's disaster risk financing and insurance plan of action, which promotes risk assessment, risk advisory, and capacity building in the region, is a strong initiative, but perhaps more is needed on that front. In addition, it has been proven that investing in resilient infrastructure provides many dividends, and that resilience building activities around the world and in the region have shown very favorable cost-benefit ratios. And you have two examples here, of one linked to typhoon forecasts and in the agricultural sector in Thailand, and the other one in terms of mangrove planting, in terms of reducing impacts of typhoons in Vietnam. The last key message is therefore to invest more on these type of actions to strike a better balance in terms of distribution of funding between disaster response and recovery and the most cost-effective preparedness and resilience building effort, which in turn significantly reduces risk. This doesn't mean that we have to reduce disaster response funding, but on the other hand, to invest more in preparedness and resilience building effort that would then naturally lead to the need for funding in terms of a disaster response in the long term. Many of the recommendations proposed here have links to the ADMIR Work Plan 2021-2025, and we emphasize aspects that we believe are crucial for adaptation and resilience building. So with this, I provide the email address of myself and Professor Horton. If you want to get in touch with us after this event, please feel free to email us, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you ever so much, Fabrice, putting together such a clear, succinct presentation for a policy report that is lengthy in length and has an unbelievable amount of content. So I think it beautifully sets the stage for our Q&A with the panelists. But I'm chair, and so a chair has perhaps the obligation, the right to have, and also I would say the pleasure to ask our panelists the first question. So I'd like the panelists to perhaps each one of them to give me some opening remarks in response to Fabrice's presentation. So Fabrice's presentation summarized the multiple threats that many of the countries in the ASEAN region face, and all of these threats will be amplified by climate change. But to the panelists, what do we think are the current strengths institutionally and in academia that will allow our nations to face these challenges effectively? And perhaps to begin, could I ask Professor Fred to give me his perspectives from the Malaysia context?
Thank you, Professor Horton. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for having me here as a panelist in this roundtable discussion. And I must say that it is a very comprehensive presentation by Dr. Fabrice. Yes, this is a region where we can assure that the most exposed is the most vulnerable to the hazard, climate-related hazard. And something that needs to be done, because we know that as climate intensified, global warming increases, we expect that there will be more hazard in the future, and more hazard means more impact. So to increase resilience, and to avoid losses, to minimize damages, one of the things that we need, of course, adaptation. And the question here, what do we have? At what stage we are now, basically, in terms of adaptation? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? And of course, I won't be able to do justice to describe everything here, but perhaps I will touch on one area which I'm very much involved, which is climate information. When you're talking about adaptation, adaptation basically local in nature, and you're talking about information, climate information at local level in decades to come, in order for action to be taken. If you were to develop, do development, that need to be incorporated. If you were to build something, information need to be incorporated. So the question here is that, are we, what is actually our position, progress in this as compared to the developed world? And of course, we are not as good as in the developed countries, but I think we are making progress here. Here we're talking about, some of you perhaps familiar with GCM, General Circulation of Global Climate Model, which is very cost. But what is needed at the local scale is much higher resolution climate information, and these need to be downscale. And in the region, there has been progress in this actually, through Codex. Unfortunately, I found out that this has not been mentioned in the report. So Codex in this region, led by myself, and many countries involved within the region and outside the region, including UK. We have Hadley Center that involved in this initiative. So we are, we have downscale CIMIC 6, CIMIC 5 model. We are embarking into CIMIC 6, and by doing so, we develop our capacity and produce the data that we need. Unfortunately, the data alone, without being used, to translate into assessment of risk on sectoral important sectors, that won't be enough. And according to IPCC PIP assessment report, some of you may know that there are many critical sectors that do not have enough information yet. This is where perhaps we have need to focus our energy in doing research in translating climate information into how climate will be impacting in the future. Perhaps I stop there, Professor Houghton.
Thank you, Fred. That was a really interesting opening remark, talking about, well, the data that we have, the capabilities that we have in the region, the international connections that are already there, but then illustrating that we have so much more to do, be that further downscaling, taking this information to have a look at solutions. And hopefully during the next hour or so, you'll have a little bit of time to perhaps discuss a little bit more about this Codex problem to the Codex research to the community. The same question though. Now let's bring in Dr. Harkunti, and perhaps you could give a perspective really from Indonesia.
Okay, thank you, Professor Houghton. Just would like to give the opening, statement or remark toward the Professor Fabrice just presented, that we are actually agree that the climate change impact actually has been worsened by the existing disaster risks, especially for coastal city as well as coastal community, which are exposed to hydrometeorological hazards such as coastal flood, fluvial flood, and also they are exposed to geological hazards such as tsunami. And then responding the impact of climate change become necessity, not only through building resilient community, but we have to understand that we need also to build the resilience for their built environment. The variability of built environment vulnerability, for example, from the physical, social, economic, as well as environmental perspective, is very important to be tackled first. In many coastal regions, we have been worsened by the impact of climate change. Reducing this vulnerability actually coupled with the increase of people capacity are significantly very important to build resilient community as well as resilient city. By protecting the people from further damage of climate change impact, this needs strong commitment of the pentahelix. Pentahelix here means like the government, the community themselves, academia, meaning university, private sector, and media or others. through 3 pillars of the higher education, what we call in Indonesia, Tri Dharma Perguruan Tinggi, which consists of teaching, research, and community empowerment. I believe that universities are preparing future generation to be able to respond to and to live with the impact of climate change. Good research may change a lot of policy. I have a lot of experience, and the good research can change the policy in this climate change impact, as well as the coastal disaster. I will share maybe in the next session, which is more on the discussion, because the issue of the early warning system for flood as well as for tsunami is become very important for the coastal community as well as coastal city. So understanding about the gap, like you have been asked, that the gap actually need to address that here is that if you're talking the climate change impact and disaster risk, people in the field doesn't understand what is the difference. They just look, the impact of climate change actually has worsened the situation of the disaster that always occur to the people, whether the very frequent disaster or the very very rare disaster. So the countermeasure of the climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, sometimes in the field, in the government, in the local government, and the community, just as that do not want to differentiate. As long as disaster in front of them, they need to combat and to tackle. Other issue that we need also is become the gap in addressing on how we can tackle climate change impact as well as disaster risk reduction, as mentioned by Professor Fabrice in the one of the target of the Sendai Framework of Action, actually is talking about transboundary governance. We know, like a lot of that, the disaster or climate change doesn't know the administration boundary. So the cities, regency, as well as all the community in those areas, they need to work hand in hand, either under boundary of the administration or between administration. And also the other issue that needs to identify here is the ego-sectoral. Ego-sectoral here meaning sometimes, if, for example, in Indonesia, in the national and to the local government, there is such distinction of the institution who is hosting the issue of the climate change issue, as well as the climate change impact issue, as well as disaster issue. So this means like they have to be synergized, they have to be blended when they need to tackle, especially if you're talking in the downstream of this climate change impact. Thank you, Professor Horton. I leave it to you back.
Thank you very much, Harkunti. That was again, that was really interesting. You brought up many points about when we're talking about climate change or natural hazards, we need to think about population growth and that increasing in the region. I really liked the sort of holistic approach that you talked about, that it's not just academia, it's governments, it's communities, it's individuals, it's the private sector. The phrase resilient city and resilient community, I jotted that one down. I think I'll be using that one. And then finally, this thing about learning about what we've done correctly. So, your role in looking at the tsunami warning center and then trying to think about how that could be used in flooding. That's really interesting. I very much enjoyed your opening remarks. So can I now pass on? Now we've heard from Malaysia, we've heard from Indonesia. Can I now pass on to Dr. Romyen, and we'll hear about some context perhaps from Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much, Fred, also for sharing the presentation. And I'm very happy to hear from the two remarks from Malaysia and also Indonesia. I would take a different approach in answering the questions of what are the strengths, instead of engaging with the paper itself, which I'm not the climate change expert. So I would look at it from the higher education perspective. So I see the three strengths, from reading this report. One is that, at the beginning of the report, although it looks very grim because it's the catalog of, how bad the region can be, it looks really grim, but at the end of it, it's actually reflected that at least in the region, we have tried to do something. And I would come back to that point later. I also see from this panel as well that within our region, we have lots of experts in climate change. And, with that, we all do our own things separately. And sometimes I guess, you also do it as a network, which is a good thing. So we have our highly committed people who advocates for the climate change adaptation and mitigation and doing the climate change education, which is good. I also hope to see maybe in this report to see the local wisdom as well of the people who are trying to do the climate change adaptation and education. So that's the first strength. Second strength that I see is that, for the fact that British Council is initiating this activity, it's clear that we are having the partners who are working on the climate change efforts as well, trying to limit the crisis stemming from the climate change. That is the second strength. But then on the regional level, I think we have a good mechanism already there, and you have discussed in the paper as well. I would also want to highlight the fact that you said ASEAN, and ASEAN have so many mechanisms in place since 1990s. We have tried to do many things. There were lots of statements coming out. There were lots of declarations coming out, which is great. There are mechanisms trying to get the countries to be involved. I would also highlight in particular for higher education and also education. I would like to highlight the SEAMEO, which is the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, which has been established since 1965. We are intergovernmental regional organization, and we are advocating for the cooperation in education, science, and culture. And what we did is that on our strategic plan for 2021 to 2030, priority 3 focus particularly on the climate change. So there are so many plans that have been in place, including for the primary education up until the higher education. So we are trying to do the training. We have the toolkits, we are working closely with UNESCO and all that. And I think this mechanism on the regional level is a good thing and is a strength for us. However, I would like to leave the first round with the remarks that even though we have so many mechanisms in place, we have so many strengths, how come we are not getting very far with the climate change outcome for our region? Perhaps we need to see more of the synergy of the people so that we actually know who are doing what, and we can actually work together. I would like to go back also before I close the first round to our Indonesian colleagues who said, we have the 3 pillars of Indonesian education philosophy, which is on teaching, research, and community. I also think that with the climate change, we have to rethink what is education for. And perhaps we have to be make it less disciplinary based, but actually interdisciplinary. We also have to realize that this is also not based on the state who can fix the problem, but rather we have to work together as a region and maybe the global level to address and tackle the problems. Thank you.
That was great. That was great. I mean, I think, again, with your perspective regarding higher education, it gives us a different type of outlook. I mean, I think, when you look at it from your perspective, you can see that there are many climate experts within the region, and we must be proud of that and know our own capabilities. But we need to use that information. I mean, I've always thought to address the climate problem, it's about information, it's about education. If you're armed with the information, then you act. So I think you really emphasize that. But also, as well as education, it's about outreach. It's about, as you said, making sure that the climate information, you have partners locally, regionally, and internationally. And then finally, I think, you brought out that climate change is just not a physical science. The problem will only be solved by understanding the physics behind climate change, but also understanding the cultural responses. So I think that was perfect. So let's stay in Thailand and let's ask our next panelist, Dr. Kannika, for her interpretation of Fabrice's presentation and the policy report regarding what, Asian nations have as an advantage to dealing with the climate problem.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Dr. Fabrice, for excellent presentation. Actually, my background is economist, and I totally, when I read your report, I totally agree with the trend that not only in Thailand but also in many regions in the world, where we are experiencing a more severe impact of climate change. And in terms of if you look back into the perspective of examining the strengths that we have, my background is in Thailand, so I would share to you the strength in terms of how we are preparing to cope with climate change, both within academia and also in terms of institutionally. So and I understand that in many countries in ASEAN, we also follow similar patterns. For example, we are in terms of institutionally, we are preparing different plans and policies to at least building up capacity of people in different sectors to cope with the impact of climate change. But and in Thailand, the key sectors that we look at are wide ranging. We look at from talking about farmers in agricultural sector to tourism and to other sector like public health and so on, right? But the problem that we have been struggling, even though we have lots of plans and policies, right? The key thing that our colleague had been sharing before is to have plans and policies and data, that is not enough, because people on the ground, on people in different sectors, in order for them to be aware and for them to act urgently to cope with the climate to combat with the climate impact, is we need to digest all this information to so that they can connect to our key message better, right? And then once they are aware of how climate change have impact on their sectors or on their business or on their everyday life, then they can come up with a more proper plan to deal with the or to build more resilience and so on. In terms of academia, in Thailand, I think many of the Thai researchers that are working on climate change, we have been working on this on over 10 years now, and I think some of our colleagues in Thailand also work with Professor Fred on this Codex sort of project as well. So we have coming up with all this issues about downscaling, climate downscaling to local areas in Thailand, and that is quite helpful in terms of helping us in shaping or crafting adaptation, both on the subnational basis and also on the sectoral basis. So in terms of the network of researchers and working on this area of climate change, I think we have been also following our ASEAN nations in terms of developing and keeping us up to date in terms of climate change adaptation research. But again, having research is not enough. But I think what we need right now in Thailand is to expand and to try to drive this research to action, so that people on the ground and in the communities, they can benefit from all the research findings that we have. So I think if to look at the gap that we have right now in Thailand in terms of making use of the report, what Dr. Fabrice has been presenting, or even the report at the more regional or global level, is to trying to digest all this information directly into something more tangible and something more easier to understand. So people in business or people on the ground, they can understand better. Yeah. So that is my first round of comments.
Thank you, Kannika. I always find to do with the climate change problem, the backgrounds that people are now coming from to address this problem. So you say that you're an economist. I know also on this panel, we have somebody who studies volcanoes. We have someone in myself who did his PhD looking at microfossils. That's what I did my PhD in, but I have the geological context to understand how much change that we're experiencing in the 20th century and how we'll experience in the 21st century. I think as true climate scientists, it's really only Professor Fred and Professor Mai who have had decades of research studying the physics of climate change. But I think from your perspective that you can see that there is just such a plethora of climate information that we have to deal with. And really, it's about getting down to the key messages that impact globally, regionally, or locally. When only you can get those key messages that are backed up by sciences, can you make your plans and policies to try and make a more resilient society? So I think that coming at it from an economic background, you see that you're hit by lots of climate information, which is important, which is not, which can you address, which can you not. So thank you very much for your perspective. So now I'd like to, as I just briefly mentioned, I'd like to return to a climate scientist. So let's get a Vietnam perspective. Prof Mai, would you like to think about what advantages does the ASEAN region have to basically become more resilient to climate change?
Okay, such as from the view of University, I would like to say some result of higher education system in Vietnam to improve the community capacity to adapt to climate change and to be more resilient. Firstly, that Vietnam National University and the other universities make a research to engage in community by the following. Firstly, organizing roundtable on the site with local community on climate change, disaster, so on. So both experience, impact, adaptation, reductions. For example, in the northern part or in Ha Giang province or in the coastal area, so on. And the second, here we install the flash flood monitoring maintained by the local people in the mountainous of Vietnam. This is conducted by Vietnam-Norway collaboration. This helps people to know before occurs a flash flood for them to evacuate better. And the third, household survey and to talk with them on climate change and disaster in Da Nang or coastal cities. And the fourth, community participation in climate change monitoring and climate change vulnerability in the north central Vietnam, because climate change appear in Vietnam and impact very diverse. So we encourage the community participating in the climate change monitoring and disaster and impact, climate change impact. And the fifth, enhancing social power and innovation in climate change response and disaster reduction. For example, here people having very good experience in living with flooding, living with drought in Mekong Delta, or living with climate change in central part of Vietnam. And so people here were encouraged to develop social fund for climate change response and disaster reductions. And when that the universities here are finding, analyzing, synthesizing and conducting the above mentioned model to transfer to and compatible with the local condition and other areas. And the sixth, that's the reason here, Vietnam Higher Education created and transfers new model of climate change response and disaster reductions, such as smart living with climate change, climate smart sector, agriculture, tourism, or aquaculture, so on, and climate smart city, village, and community. And also now we come to the climate smart and sustainable city and resilient and low carbon economy society. So that we have some way. And also here the question about how to make a climate smart city to be developed in Asian countries. So we have the proposed here 3 solutions. Firstly, scientific sound-based policy and investment synergy between smart and sustainable city with the other, for example, sustainable development strategies, green growth strategy, renewable energy, or climate change response, and these other reduction strategy. And the second is create ASEAN network of smart and sustainable cities to help each other to develop this kind of model of city. And the fourth is the firstly, make successful pilot of a smart and sustainable city based on the government, it's a local and central collaboration with the university and city community, business sector before expanding to the other cities. So that's my some small input to the improving capacity of the community to adapt to climate change and to be better resilient. Thank you.
Hey, Prof. Mai, I really wanted you to be on the panel, so I was very pleased that you were able to join us because, you know, I wasn't disappointed with your opening remarks. I think you pulled together some threads that other panelists have said. I mean, it's all about improving the capacity of the country to be more resilient to climate change. We've heard this said a few times now about engaging with the community. I mean, I really think that that's the pathway forward here. I really liked your idea about working with the community on monitoring their own disasters. This sort of idea of citizen science, I think, is really important. That's how you engage in the community, if they can actually collect the data that contributes to the science. That then links into this aspect that you talked about to do with social capital on how they respond to climate. And then we've heard this idea of resilient cities before, but I was really pleased to your idea about the cities combining themselves to see what works and what doesn't. So thank you very much for your comments, Professor Mai. So last, but by no means least, we now have an outside perspective, I suppose, from institutes of higher learning from Quintin. So perhaps you could give a perspective on how you see the institutes of higher learning helping us here in ASEAN better prepare for the future.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Horton. I mean, you know, having being the only person on the panel who hasn't progressed beyond the master's level, I still hold on to one of the key learnings I got. You know, one of the first required readings we had at Cambridge, which was Roger Pilkey's book about the honest broker, right? I mean, the idea that scientists have to be there at the policy forefront to make sure that policymakers, developers, project managers have an informed decision to make with to really create these long-term last mile delivery solutions. So I'm pleased to see that the academics and the higher Institute of Higher Learning are actually producing more of these pracademics. These folks are on the front lines already in terms of looking at policymakers and talking at the local government level to make sure they make very, very informed decisions. And what I've seen with these academics, so to speak, is you're getting more data-driven, more proven, more scalable approaches to solutions in terms of risk mitigation for climate change. And I see them at 3 levels. And this is in our experience as a project developer. The first is on the policy level. On the policy level, you're seeing more scientists, more economists, more subject matter experts come and testify at Congress, especially in the Philippines, where the emerging legislation is coming out to create more SDG-orientated policies. Everything from renewable energy legislation to frameworks for disaster risk, early warning monitoring system, climate change funding. Those things are coming in, and it's important now that we see more of these academics and experts come in at the testimony and subject matter expert level, so that these policies, when the sausage gets made into an actual policy, that they're balanced and fair. Second, at the regional level, we're looking also at infrastructure planning. And a lot of this money, if you look at it even in the Philippines, where we have this build program, one of the few bright spots here under this administration, you're seeing a lot of the money being poured into the kind of infrastructure that may or may not have SDGs in mind. So the idea that you're spending billions and billions of dollars without having proper planning, proper fit for purpose type infrastructure that takes care of the ecosystem, vulnerability to storm surges. And thirdly, how does it affect your agriculture policy? Because the Philippines is also struggling with agriculture for food security. Those things have to be done at the planning level. And that is where scientists can come in with their studies in terms of climate change and also how to put proper fit for purpose infrastructure in place. Finally, on the project development level, this is where we come in. We've got investments and a pool of investments to come in. But to reduce risk on the project level, we will need scientists to also look at helping with these studies, everything from wind mapping to solar irradiance, to tidal surge studies that allow us to deploy the kind of renewable energy technologies at the last mile delivery solution, similar to that picture behind me, which is a microgrid that we have in Palawan, one of the most fragile ecosystems in the world. So at the end of the day, at the project level, we do need these third-party independent experts to make sure we reduce project risk so that we can bring in these investments and really come in for good as these last mile delivery solutions come in. Finally, because a lot of the policies don't get implemented without funding, I think finance institutions that are geared towards ESG will appreciate very much independent, credible research that allows them to really move the needle in terms of where they put their investment portfolios. So it allows developers like us to create these last mile delivery solutions on the ground. So with that, Ben, thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to join the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Quintin. I could listen to you talk for a long time. I think the information that you have very much needed by academic institutions. I could just think about the Earth Observatory of Singapore. We have tried and we have failed in trying to get our scientific information to be used in policy, to be used in infrastructure, to be used in investment. So I think it's really important that this dialogue happens, and it happens really, really quickly, that you can understand the data, you can understand the research capabilities that the Institutes of Higher Learning have. But then from our side, it's how we communicate with you. What type of data do you need? When do you need it? If I think about my area of research, sea level rise projections for 2150, are they really that important with a variety of different scenarios? Or do you just want to know what's going to happen in the next 30 years? At the 1 in 100 year chance, something like that. I think it's really interesting. So, hey, each one of you gave really opening remarks from different perspectives, different countries, based upon your career experience, the projects that you're currently working on. Now I'm going to turn it over to some question and answers. So over the last couple of weeks, we've been collating questions from the participants, and we've tried to group them because we can't ask all of them, obviously. And then we're going to give them to each individual panelist or a group of panelists to try and get some answers from them. So the first question that I'd like to bring up is really, let's dial down into why is there a climate emergency in Asia? And really, the person to ask this would be to someone who spent 35 years understanding climate impacts in Asia. So Fred, could you really dial this down on why is there a climate emergency in Asia?
Well, it's not fair. I'm always get the first one, But I'm more than happy to answer this question. It's very important question. Perhaps to different people, the word key emergency or the climate emergency could have a different meaning, but we know what it means. There's some urgency that need to to take in terms of ensuring that there will be less impact in the future, and of course for the region. As we understand from Fabrice's presentation, this is a region where most exposed and most vulnerable. And as we heard from many members of the panels, there are some perhaps progress there, but there are also many gaps that need to be looked into, and then we need to take action. So everybody have roles to play. But when it comes to emergency, let me just quote some of the study that people have carried out in this region. Southeast Asia, topping the list in terms of number of disaster, for the last 30 or 40 years in Asia. Compare with East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia. Southeast Asia is topping the list in terms of number of disasters, and most of these basically climate-related disasters. We have typhoons, we have flood, we have drought, we have almost everything. Don't forget that we have sea level rise as well, and many cities that already having problem with sea level rise. Perhaps Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, in Mekong Delta is having problem with saltwater intrusion as well. So so the prospect is not good for us, and of course we need to solve this problem, and as perhaps everybody know that the solution for this is two ways. One is mitigation, and the world need to reduce greenhouse gases emission, and of course the other one is adaptation. So when we're talking about mitigation, perhaps we know that currently we have in terms of annual emission, we have about 51 gigaton CO2 equivalent, and according to the IPCC, by 2030 this has to be reduced by 50%. To the level of 20 to 30 gigaton, and that is enormous. That is actually the big challenge for the world in reducing that. But we know that if we fail, and then there will be more, this kind of event, extreme event, flooding, drought, perhaps strengthened typhoons, So the other side of the coin, definitely we need to adapt, and this is why I think that adaptation is very important, and perhaps many countries in the region already getting up into what this. Maybe I can highlight here for Malaysia. Recently, the Ministry of Environment and Water has announced that they are actually trying to establish this so-called national adaptation plan. Perhaps some other countries in the region is also or already have established this plan or in the process of establishing it. Malaysia also basically pledged to increase the commitment in terms of greenhouse gases reduction from 35% to 45% by 2030 relative to 2005, and basically that's good news. But when it comes to adaptation, I think many panelists have said this. Research alone is not enough. We need to translate research into policy, into action. So to fill up those national adaptation plan, I think everybody have a role. Academia have a roles, of course, policymakers have roles, and people like me, for example, it's not just sufficient for us to do research and publish and that's it. So I think we need to make sure that the science, the data, at the end of the day, will be used to solve the problem. And if we don't solve the problem, I think this region is going to be, in decades to come, perhaps by mid of century, we will have more extreme, more strengthened typhoon. We have sea level rise, and I would say that that's something that need urgent attention. And yes, we are in climate emergency, Professor Halton. So I stop it there, maybe, Prof.
Thank you very much, Prof. Fred. Thanks for highlighting this really important aspect of translating research into policy, into action. But earlier in your presentation, you were talking about the fact that we've made a lot of progress. So that's good. And I can see like several IPCC reports and many research papers coming out. But I guess there are still a lot of gaps in climate research in ASEAN. And my question is really, how can universities help with this? What are these research gaps and what can we do? So maybe is that a question, it's maybe a question from another scientist, maybe Prof. Mai, if you have some answers about that, and maybe Prof. Fred afterwards, if you want to comment.
Sure, maybe after Professor Mai.
Professor Mai, you're muted.
Yes, here the gap in the both institutional and academia. So I see in every country of the ASEAN has a difficulties and gaps, different way to see. But here we can see some gaps. Firstly, the collaboration between sectors, ministries, and between the central government and local governments. So we can see this intergovernmental sector should be very highly improved. The first, it means now the collaboration between these still not so good. The first. The second is that concerning directly with the system of the institution for climate response. They have overlapping the functions and tasks. For example, we have the National Committee for Climate Response, and then we have the climate response section in each ministry, and also it section in each province governments on the climate response and disaster reductions, and not should be making not overlapping. And the third thing here in the institution that climate change response now led by another one ministry. The disaster reductions managed by the other ministry, and the collaboration between the ministry and committee is not so well and should be improved. And the third thing is the innovating the institutions have the two direction. Too fast, it means not foundation not so long and it change again. And the second opposite way, this institution not innovated for a long time. No academia. So about the academia, we can see here the first about improvement of the quality of human resource of the system, institutional, and the second that improving the facilities of the academia institutions concerning climate response and disaster reductions. And also another thing should be we can see here big data on climate disaster should be developed, updated, and to be shared and used between sectors, between and for all concerned people, stakeholders. And now the last one is here that better and more effective cross institutions and academia policy sector collaboration in climate change response and disaster reductions, both in nationally and regionally and internationally. So here, as I agree with previous professor from the Technology Institute about the policy sometimes not based on the sound scientific fundamentals, but now academia and policy collaboration, very big gap have to be improved in the future. And also the last one for both, that digital transformation or digital technology should be used for both institutional and academia sector for climate change response and climate change disaster. That this aspect for the digital transformation and digital technology have just come to Vietnam, and also there's a lot of things to have to improve and to use this both opportunity and overcoming the challenges from the digital transformation and technology for climate change response and disaster. And that's some gap from view of Vietnam, and to share with you. And maybe I would like to hear from the gap in the institutional academic system for climate change response and disaster in another countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Mai. So I think you made a very good point about the need for better collaboration between scientists and policymakers. And that's why I think this today's session is very important. But I wanted maybe to also ask Prof. Fred, because I remember from his opening remarks, Prof. Fred, you were putting a lot of emphasis on the need to downscale, to really downscale climate research at local level. So I wanted to maybe ask you whether you had further comments on this, because my question was really about knowledge gaps and how can universities help. So Prof. Mai made a very good comment about the need for HR and resources and sharing data, but I was wondering whether maybe you had an angle about the science itself and the knowledge that needs to be tackled.
Thank you, Lauren. I pick up a few words, keywords from Professor Mai. One is collaboration. In research, in solving problem, it doesn't have to be you alone. Everybody have a role, and if we join forces, I think we can solve things in a rather easily manner. And this is what we have done in CODEX. Well, some of you perhaps don't know what is this. This is actually, CODEX is an acronym, stand for Coordinated Regional Climate Downscaling. It is a program under the World Climate Research Program, which is basically under the World Meteorological Organization. So, around the world, we have this so-called domain, and the whole globe, basically we have about 14 domains. In the Southeast Asia, we have one domain, which is coordinated by myself. And this is actually a platform where, modeling groups can work together and to downscale GCM into using different RCM. And this is actually beautiful. Why? Because, one institution won't be able to downscale so many GCM with so many RCM. But yet, when it comes to producing information, we need to have multiple RCM, multiple GCM, so that we could have a robust information, as opposed to only a single GCM and a single RCM. And this is why collaboration works, basically. And perhaps we can use the same kind of philosophy for when you're talking about addressing translating this information into how climate change is going to be affecting critical sectors in the future. And we are actually trying to link up with some of you perhaps knows May's Future Earth, which is based in Beijing, China, where we are thinking of creating a program where young scientists could develop a proposal and perhaps apply funding and collaborate. But at the end of the day, Lauren, research is research. Without we are able to translate this into policy, I think it won't make much impact. I have done research so many years, published so many papers, but like Professor Horton said, that I think I would say that we fail to ensure that every papers that we produce end up in policy. And in Malaysia now, we have this tendency, we have this approach by the government. They give funding, they make sure that the research that you do, you produce one policy paper. So in order to do that, at the research level, you need to engage stakeholders. You need to engage, and perhaps I can share my current research, which is also downscaling, but not only downscaling, but we are working together with scientists in the hydrology, translating that into looking at the water resources and water balance. Working with another set of scientists looking at health, and working another set of scientists looking at the socio-economic impact. So and hence, previously I was just like working on climate downscaling, but now we have a project where it's really multidisciplinary. And perhaps with that kind of approach, it's easier for policymakers to relate, from climate change into into water resources, into health, into socioeconomic impact, community, and so on. So I think this is the thing, Lauren. So perhaps the way we do research need to maybe change a little bit. It's not just for publishing. For instance, we need to make sure that it ends up into policy making as well as action.
Thank you, Fred, for that final remark. I think it's really interesting that the vast majority of academics will get research funding to do research papers, and here at NTU, an assistant professor's career is driven by academic publications in peer review. What is your H index? How many citations? It is exceedingly hard, if not impossible, to get tenure here at NTU writing policy papers, particularly if you come from STEM. If you're in a science-based department, you've got to write papers, tier 1A journals. And so we've been trying to address that. Fortunately, at the Earth Observatory of Singapore, we have Lorienne's team, where their KPIs is to take our science and then translate it into policy. But many other institutions don't have that luxury. And I think that, in some ways, is the responsibility of the senior academics, both as participants, but also on the panel, to start to get people's careers to be acknowledged, promoted based upon their impacts on the community, not just the impacts in terms of citation in a high impact journal. It's how we change it from within. Anyhow, I'd like to move on, and it has some relationship to this. I'd like to move on. We had a variety of questions from participants about sort of the climate change curriculum. Should there be more climate change topics discussed within the university curriculum? If so, what topics are missing? And I'd like to turn this question over to Fabrice. Fabrice obviously has a prominent position within the University of Glasgow, but obviously has a career where he has knowledge of undergraduate or climate change or curriculum in general, both in Asia and also in Europe. So Fabrice, what are your thoughts about the climate change curriculum, both in the UK, in Europe, but also here in ASEAN?
Thanks, Ben. I'll try to answer that. It's a lot, but
it's huge. It's huge. I know.
I do think that in terms of climate change education, if you will, we need to have many more inputs into the various disciplines that the university has, and that, you know, start distilling some of the climate change language, some of the importance of climate change into these disciplines, whether it's the natural sciences, whether it's the social sciences, whether it's the humanities. I think, though, that where it's more crucial to act more everywhere, I think, is to try to train students to think in an interdisciplinary way. I mean, we've had from the interventions so far talking about, you know, the policy brief that we're working on, about, you know, communities, about cities, about coastal areas, about downscaling. All these need to be in one sense for some aspects of the curricula that are being developed. So, you know, to start having students given the opportunity to interact with each other coming from various disciplines. So, you know, you can develop highly interdisciplinary courses within specific faculties, perhaps. But I think that what might be interesting also is to create some fora or opportunities for students from different disciplines or colleges to work collaboratively on credit earning micro projects that are related to climate change, for example. Now that perhaps is complicated because of the administrative boundaries that you may have within universities, but that could be, you know, really a way forward to try to get that interdisciplinary thinking, understanding that the issues that we're facing are hugely complex, and that it's by working together, or at least being able to think in these complex systems way, that we can provide, you know, young academics that are going to be able to generate solutions to the problematic of climate change in the future. I hope that answers the question.
I think Fabrice, that's a great starting. I mean, you know, I think climate change needs to be given as an introductory topic to all types of discipline. It certainly has moved on from being just about the physical sciences. So I think your aspect regarding that. Could I ask Harkunti for her perspectives regarding this, please?
Okay, thank you, Professor Horton. I would like to share based on my experience in my school, because my school is School of Planning and Policy Development, that one of the concentration for the postgraduate is on the disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So this is very interesting. I agree with Professor Fabrice just mentioned that we need interdisciplinary. But basically my school is also, we have interdisciplinary, not only the planning aspect, but we have also social aspect, engineering aspect, economic aspect, and so on. But the issue here, if we have this concentration in the, you know, the master program or postgraduate program, the main issue here is not only having classes in the curriculum, because classes is not enough. You can modify the class. You said not only interaction in the lecture and then the student project and so on, but what we have here is studio. Studio is like what you call this, about 4 credits for 1 semester, and all the student is joining the studio because this is compulsory. Studio for planning is just like what you have in laboratory. They make the laboratory in the field. They go to one city or one regency. They explore all the issue that they have faced related with the disaster, risk reduction, as well as the climate change impact. So this is very important. Not only see the physical aspect, social aspect, environmental aspect, or as well infrastructure aspect, but they also look at the governance and then all the regulation that has been used to combat or to tackle disaster risk as well as the climate change impact. So this is very interesting, learning by doing. So you can see directly, because we put the studio at the end of the year. So the last semester, the semester 3, so at least they have the knowledge before from semester 1 and semester 2. And then using the studio will also enrich the student perspective, especially when they conduct the thesis. So this is I would like to share based on my experience. Thank you, Professor Horton.
That's interesting. So Fabrice mentioned these micro projects, and then you followed up by saying it's not just appropriate to just give them lecture material in the climate sciences. You can't just do something on, land management, land planning, and then just deliver some lectures on the impact of flooding. You run this studio-based approach. I've been involved in those sort of things in one of my previous jobs when I was at the University of Pennsylvania. They have a big land management project, and they've had these studios where all the students were interacting from different disciplines on a project, and really it is very interdisciplinary. I really like that aspect. I think climate change in general is really, obviously it's an emergency, it's huge in Asia, but it has so many spin-offs that will significantly improve society, significantly improve education, because it's a problem based in the physical sciences, but will be solved outside the physical sciences, be it in communication, adaptation, and mitigation. So really interesting. Lorianne, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, perhaps I was a bit curious because we talked a lot about curriculum, but I think there are a lot of things that really universities can do. And I'm just wondering whether you think universities are really showing the example in combating climate change, maybe through their activities, and what more can they do? And maybe for this, I'm going to be a bit provocative, let's say, that's my role today. So I'm going to ask two people who are not from universities, giving maybe their opinion coming from an outsider. So maybe Quintin, you would like to give us your opinion on this? You're muted, Quintin.
Lorianne, did you want to focus on the gaps themselves between the academia and actual policy? Yeah, so in this case, I really feel that having a more, I keep using the term, but it's something that's really caught on with me, is a more pracademic approach, being able to, as in the region, we've seen more science diplomats. That's what they call them here. I think overseas, they call them honest brokers, but you're going to see some applied research being done at both the academic level and then at the policy level. So what I'd like to see more of is that this integrated type approach, Professor Horton was talking about as well, that dialogue in these platforms happen. Definitely conferences are good exchange platforms, but to me, it's at the regional planning levels. Each country, by my understanding, has a regional development council. In the Philippines, for example, there are these councils where scientists are absent. At the end of the day, they only rely on, let's say, the municipal planning officer, who probably does not have a degree in the sciences. And a lot of it is a garbage in, garbage out approach. So if the academe were to step in and update and translate that research into something that's palatable and very translatable to a policy perspective, that would be very much welcome. One key example that I wanted to share was something when I was at Chevron before, in the geothermal side, we were working with the province of Albay, where it's very heavy in terms of climate risk, but geohazard risk, because a lot of the volcanoes and volcanic activity is there. Hence, there's also geothermal in that area. We actually we sponsored a sustainable development guidebook that was run by the Manila Observatory. And Manila Observatory is one of our leading climate institutions in the Philippines. And they were able to parse out all this climate data, all the impacts from a 1 degree rise and how that would affect crop changes, how that would affect infrastructure, how that would affect agricultural productivity. Those things were actually translated into a 100-page guidebook with a very succinct executive summary. And that was given to the governor of Albay, who was not a scientist, but a very keen policymaker who was very, very much conscious of how much funding he had, which is very little. And in that sense, he was able to plan an infrastructure plan, farm to market roads, early warning systems based on that science. So that money that little money did not go to waste. In fact, Albay province is now one of the most sound by way of policy and risk mitigation. And that's because some scientists stepped up to the plate. They were underwritten by a private sector firm like ourselves. And in the case that there is no private sector firm that needs it for its corporate responsibility, it would be great if the grants and the funders and, let's say, the multilaterals would come in to fill in that role. But that dialogue, that succinct type of documentation that goes to policy is going to be very critical down the road.
Thanks, Quintin. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I wonder whether maybe the other another non-academic at the moment, maybe Kannika, you want to comment from your perspective, maybe the economic background you have? You want me to repeat the question? Or, yeah. So.
Yep. Actually, I have seen like university like contributing like on this climate change, like, especially on the ground, like especially in the areas of climate change adaptation. In like in many parts, like I see that like nowadays, like people, they are not only focusing only on like working on research and then getting published as such, but I see like a number of researchers, like those who are working with local communities in terms of translating like this climate projection that is like quite technical and complicated for people to understand into something that is like more tangible. Like, for example, they use like infographic and things like that to make it easier for people in the local communities to connect to, and then like trying to convince them that like, you know, if they are like staying in like the same type of housing or growing the same crops and things like that, like for like from now on, like how would that be jeopardized by like this impact of climate change like going to be intensified in the future, right? So I think that is like how university can transfer knowledge like to local people and people in the communities like in a more tangible way. And on top of that, I think university can also showcases like how they can set example like on like mitigation side as well, like and I have seen like a number of like university in the region and also in Thailand, like now they are pursuing the goal of like green university or eco university. So they're trying to come up with like this carbon footprint like calculation and how they can like minimize the impact of like the footprint that have on the environment and also on the community nearby university, right? So that is like I think from both like mitigation side and on adaptation side, I have seen a lot of progress in terms of like how university both in Thailand and in other ASEAN nations are like improving on that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very good news. Thanks a lot, Kannika. It's good to see that you saw some progress at least. So thank you.
Okay, I'd like to sort of that last question was interesting. I think we have this common thread that the institutes of higher learning and the academics within them have to start to modify their activities. They have to start to understand how to dialogue with industry, with business. We need to be able to communicate our information to our stakeholders in government, in communities, and at the local level. And I'd like to stay within discussing universities. I'd like us to think now about what sort of new collaborations could universities develop to let's think about our students here. If there's one group of the community that is energized about climate change, it is our undergraduates. So how can we use that momentum across the universities? How can we use that momentum within our communities? And are there any obstacles in place? I'd like to open the answer to this question to Romyen. Maybe you could think about student exchanges or interdisciplinary research. Romyen, what are your thoughts?
Okay, if I may step back a little bit and start by, asking myself when I accept the invitation to join this panel, the two persons that pops up in my mind when you are asking me to participate in this event is one, Seven Suzuki. Some of you who are really into the climate change, you would know her. She was 12 years old, spoke at the Rio 1992 summit. And another person is Greta Thunberg. I think both of which are the youth, the present and youth and the future leaders who are really having a great concern about the climate change and environmental degradation. They are the activists and they are real. We are talking about climate change and we are talking about the scholars, and it sounds like it's all in academia. but the climate change problems is real. It's a problem that is actually facing us. So in the university, we have to start asking ourselves, what is the education for? You know, it's not for the high index, you know, high H index, or it's not about the publication. It's not about the research. It's not about the policy. It's actually about us, about the well-being of us, you know, and what the life we will hand over for the next generation. So if you are asking me what is this collaboration is for, I would say we are collaborating in all aspects and in all levels. For us to actually groom the global citizen, the people who are actually in concern of what is the climate change, what it would affect us, you know, and what happens in Thailand will also happens, you know, we do have the effects in Malaysia. I'm coming from a small town, you know, at the border of the northernmost part of Thailand. We have haze problems, we have catalog of disaster, and it doesn't respect the border. You know, whatever happens is actually cross over the border. So the collaboration, whether it's the research, it needs to be something that focusing on the solution. And it needs to be well communicated with all the learners. And when I'm saying learners, the learners are not just the students, but learners are all of us. You know, if I'm coming from different disciplines, I should also learn about the climate change, you know, from the scientists. And the scientists maybe also should know about the climate change from different aspects as well. So making it real, making it that is something of the problems that we are facing. And at the end of the day, as the educator and administrator, make sure as well that you can lead, you know, the organization, or you can lead the higher education institutions as a role model for others. Don't just preach others without actually acting, you know, what you preach. So if you are going to say, you know, other institutions or other organizations should act on the climate change, mitigation or adaptation, you yourself show it. In the university, as an administrator, you should be able to show it. And as an administrator, you can collaborate on that level to make sure that it does happen. You synergize the effort. For lecturers, you also having to think that you are also learners. You learn from the community as well when you go out. You learn from the local wisdom. You also learn from the students. And there are more learners that you have to be, you know, responsible for. And I think with the collaboration across the region or across the borders is also very important, because at the end of the day, the climate change is interconnected, interdisciplinary, and please make it real, because at the end of the day, even though you are an educator, you are also a wife, you are also a husband, you are also a sister, you are also somebody's loved ones. So please act as this real problems and groom the future generation to be a global citizen. Thank you.
Romyen, if I was able to, I would give you I'd give you a standing ovation for that little segment. That was very passionate. You hit all the right notes there. I mean, you know, climate change. Well, you know, I've been studying it for 25 years of my life, and I have this phrase: if you knew what I know, you'd be very, very scared about what climate change will do to every single citizen on planet Earth. And we really need to mobilize every single person. It's not sufficient to be an academic who writes research papers on climate. You have to take this information out to the public. You have to take this information to the students. We've got such momentum with that. That was really good. That was really good. You know, I'm glad this is recorded, and I hope a lot of people listen to that little few minutes. I'd like to ask the same question though, because I think it's a really interesting question to Harkunti about how these universities can work across, between and among universities, and what any of the obstacles are.
Okay, thank you, Professor Harton. Yeah, so I would like just to add our colleagues, Dr. Romyen, what she has just expressed. Based on our experience, there are two types of the collaboration across the university. First, if we, for example, for Indonesia cases, if we collaborate with the local university, so this is have a good impact on the, you know, the capacity building of the local university. also from our university perspective, we also can learn directly from the field. So this is one issue that is need to be highlighted. The second issue here, that back to the studio, we have now is every year we have what we call summer camp. Summer camp studio is actually collaboration with my university, with University of Sydney in Australia, that some students from the University of Australia, they come to Indonesia, and we pick up several cases. For example, we go to the coastal city or coastal community, and they work in 3 months, and then identifying and everything like I just expressed in the studio curriculum. And then this is a good thing, learning also by encouraging the student from the different country, different culture of study and culture of research and culture of that. This is kind of important that people have a broad perspective. Another example that we also have experienced, that we have what we call the RC, Disaster Resilient, also Climate Change Adaptation Program. So this is a kind of like summer school, summer program, but it's composed of the university from Japan, Indonesia, ITB, my university. Also we have from Thailand, and also we have from Vietnam. So some ASEAN university contribute on this program. So this is a kind of credit earning. The student learn in several different, for example, in Japan, in ITB, in Thailand, and then they have picked up several cases, a kind of studio, but enriched with the lecture. So they have, we have joint lectures from those 5 universities in ASEAN with the Japanese university. So increase also the, eagerness of the student to learn directly from the field. And then other experience also is across university, everybody knows we are from university that we have joint or collaborative research. Collaborative research is good, but not only producing the, Q1, Q2, the journal paper, but also how we can develop the policy brief together from the different perspective. For example, my collaboration with my colleagues from UK, you have different style, we have our different style. So learning from each other is very good. How we make policy brief from other country with other country. Also, this is have a good learning because our research for sure involving the student. Okay, thank you, Professor Hartan. I'll leave it back to you.
Thank you very much, Harkunti. I was wondering about this this question about involving different people, having different styles and so on. So I really have a question about how do you ensure inclusivity in all those activities? May that be policy briefs, may that be community engagement activity, which I noticed from this panel is a very important topic. And I know we have somebody who's done that a lot in her work. So Romyen, maybe you would like to comment on this aspect?
Yes, thank you very much, Lauren, for the question. The issues of inclusivity, I think is crucial. Easier said than done, I have to say. But first of all, I think to start with, we have to know who are actually different sectors or with different groups of the people you want them to be included. And usually most of the case when you are talking about inclusivity is the issues of power relations. If you have sort of scientists, or you have the scientists, meaning the people with the knowledge, or you have the policymaker, the people with the power, usually you don't really see the local, or you can really hear the people who are less power, having less power. So what I'm trying to say is that when you do inclusivity, making sure that you are including everyone who may be affected from this, who may or may not have the knowledge, or you assume that they or may not have the knowledge, or they can't really contribute, or you're making sure you include them. I take, for example, and I would address this, in relation to the previous question that you asked, what are the possible collaboration? I take example of the recent mobility programs that we are planning on conducting. So, the COVID-19, the travel distance, your travel restrictions, you cannot travel. So we were thinking, how do we actually address these problems? Because still internationalization is very important, especially if the student learns about, the climate change issues, or, the SDGs issues, it would be good for them. So we are working with the EU chair, who is, I think the lead is also here with us, and British Council in Bangkok, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, setting up the webinar called the CU Mobility Programs, the Southeast Asia and EU, but we call it CU because we hope to see you, mobility programs, and it's the exchange programs for the young learners. But when we are planning these activities, we are also including the learners themselves. So they are with us, telling us what they wanted to know. We are not assuming that we know everything, even though I've been in higher education sector for a long time, almost 20 years. I wouldn't assume that I know everything. So we actually ask them, and even the EU delegations and all that, listen to them. So this is what I mean by inclusivity. Inclusivity also means participation. It has to be a meaningful participation. But in order to actually start the inclusivity process, you have to also be able to see who are in the picture. And I guess for the climate change, it's everybody. And I also saw in the question, the Q&A, which sector is the most important sector? I would say, actually, we all have responsibility to contribute to this climate change. It's like you have 5 fingers. Each fingers can do different things, but you do what you can, because at the end of the day, to lift something up, you need all the 5 fingers. So there you are.
Thank you very much, Romyen. Ben, you want to move on to next?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the answers from everyone are so good. I wish we had more time, but we have to quickly move on. I mean, the aspect of inclusivity is crucial on climate. So I really wish we had more time on that. And just some of the suggestions and, examples of things that have worked that Harkunti mentioned. I mean, these exchange programs with Sydney or with Japan and Indonesia, trying to make sure that people understand things from different perspectives. And what significantly concerns me with the COVID pandemic is that these are being lost. And I know about this at NTU. We used to have many student exchange programs, and they've all been abandoned. And I really hope that they are going to return, and they should be an emphasis, because climate change and sustainability is a global issue, certainly a regional issue, and Singapore cannot solve it on its own. On the topic of not being able to solve it, perhaps one of the most difficult questions to address is why, when hundreds of scientists, if not thousands of scientists, with putting in so many hours on the topic of climate change, why have we been unsuccessful in mitigating action? So this is a tough question, and I'm going to ask 2 people for quick answers regarding this. First of all, Fabrice, what are your thoughts? What are your perspectives?
Right, thanks. As you say, it's a tough question, but I think that the uptake from science into policy is traditionally quite lengthy, regardless of what you're looking at. Perhaps one exception is the hole in the ozone layer, where there was a lot of scientific evidence that was provided, and clear danger that was menacing us, and swift policy action was taken. Perhaps the issue that we have with climate change is that it's not readily visible. Somebody has mentioned in the panel before that the hazards exist, they're compounded by climate change, but we face floods, we face droughts, etc. And therefore the notion of climate change on top of that may not be very clear. Now this is becoming less and less true. I mean, we have more and more hazards and impacts that are clearly attributable to climate change. And you can see now, I think, that there is a big upsurge into policy uptake in trying to address this issue, with many net zero initiatives that are stemming around the world, including in the UK, with a lot of research that is being targeted at the application. What do we do? What are the consequences for the communities, for the economic systems, etc., that are cropping out. So from that angle, I think that we are perhaps at a tipping point in a positive way, that this realization is really there now, and that a lot is going to happen in the next few years. At least this is what I hope, because otherwise we will face huge problems.
That's really interesting, Fabrice, that you think this is just the natural way of things, that, you know, with something as complex as climate change, that it will take many years for it to distill down and overcome a variety of obstacles, be they economic or policy or socio-economic or institutional, before you can actually make change. I never really thought of it like that. That's really interesting, that it was just always going to take 30 years to go from the initial science to now what we're seeing with COP26 and actions being taken, local, regional, governmental, regulation by business. I'd like to ask Kannika for her thoughts based upon perspectives where she works.
Yeah, I think like for climate on climate change, like even though like most people think that we have been lots of work had been done like for so many years, especially the scientists, like in terms of the climate modeling and so on. But when you want to observe like the progress of like on climate change, like especially adaptation and mitigation, the people who are being evaluated are mostly the communities or people in the business sector that are working on mitigation, or people in other sector like tourism and so on, right? So in order to translate from like the scientific progress, like in terms of climate change, into action, I think the communication with the relevant like stakeholders is still lacking. So in so many years, like we have published like this technical IPCC report and so on, right? But in order to translate those scientific modeling and data into like concrete action or like adaptation, I think it is important now that we need to urgently communicate better with the relevant like stakeholders. And even though like the stakeholders, they now understand better, but it is not necessary that they can adapt to climate change. Like we have been lots of like study that like people who want to adapt to climate change or take action, but they sometimes do not have access to finance. Like now, like the private, we need to also engage like the banking sectors and the private sector to allow them to, those farmers who want to switch crop varieties, or those like people in the tourism sector who want to adapt into like changing like the tourism strategy and so on. All of this need like financing in terms of to allow them to mobilize their actions, right? So on top of like communication, the second one is like facilitating access to climate finance. And the third one that I think is very important is like trying to allow them to access to technology that can allow them to adapt. So I think these 3 points are quite important in terms of not only focusing on like climate change research, but also we need to translate this research into action by allowing and engaging people on the ground. Yeah.
That's really important, Kannika. I think, you know, on climate communication, we've achieved so much, but there's so much more to learn. I think also to do with the COVID pandemic, we're going to learn so much about how to communicate vaccines, transmission rates, how you can communicate such complex information to a variety of stakeholders will only help us in climate change. Okay, as we're drawing to a close, but I still want to get some feedback from a couple of other panelists. So Harkunti, do you want to add a little bit more about science and climate change?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree with just has been expressed with Kannika, that actually the most important how to change policy through science. Based on my experience in developing the flood early warning system in Jakarta, which is like what I call here community-based flood early warning system, that we work closely with the pentahelix, not only the local government, but we also work with the national government, because there are transboundary issues between city to city, which is need to tackle about the flood, which is from the, for example, Ciliwung River Basin. Another issue here that we need also to collaborate with the community, because they are the last mile, they are the first mile. They are suffering from the impact of the disaster due to the climate change. And also we work closely with other, for example, the business sector, which can help for that. So how we can work with that? The most important that we can have good research, starting from having hazard mapping, and then identifying the real critical issue, their vulnerability, and how to tackle this. So based on this valid research, so we can talk with them using the risk communication. Without having sound or good research, they will not buy, especially, for example, when our project in Jakarta, because there are a lot of good education people, but different if you are working in the very remote area. So this is most important. From good research, actually we are able also to have the policy change, especially in the warning system. A lot of this is again experience when I developed the tsunami warning system, that we have to deal with these multi-stakeholders. Thank you. Yeah.
Again, really, really nice sort of like summary about, I mean, I really like that aspect that, you know, the people on the front line are the ones who are going to experience the impact of climate change first, but they're also going to provide the solutions, or certainly implement the adaptations to climate change. I think that's a really nice aspect. Perhaps the last answer should go to Quintin. I think you would have a very unique perspective on this, on why scientists didn't really achieve or took time to achieve their objectives on climate action.
Yeah, Professor Horton, thank you very much. I mean, I think it's just a question of gaining consensus among experts, and obviously that between egos and expertise, and then trying to get together on the same platform for exchanging it into practical policy. That's always a work in progress. But I did want to address what Kannika was talking about. In the post-pandemic world, finance is going to be a very critical lever in terms of getting research into policymakers' hands, so you can really move the needle. I just want to give a key example as a takeaway where the rubber meets the road is that the idea of blockchain and a lot of crowdfunding events, these are actually being done by academics. In fact, Chevron and my employer, WEnergy, has basically engaged Dartmouth and the top business school to develop blockchain solutions to trace electrons, to allow generation units like the one behind me to be able to trace, track, and monetize. And we need data scientists and, you know, good integrity documents so that companies who do put them on the market, whether it be carbon credits or secondary markets, are able to monetize these. So at the end of the day, that is a great enterprise where academic institutions retain their integrity and still are able to monetize their research. But it does move the needle in terms of building these last mile delivery solutions like what's behind me moving forward, and using applied scientists to make things happen for good. I just want to add that because that's ongoing right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Quintin. I think this aspect of applied science is really, really important. But, you know, I'll return to something I said earlier. Applied science is difficult for academics. You know, I was formerly the chair of the Asian School of the Environment here. So, you know, for an assistant professor to get tenure, applied science doesn't cut it. Policy papers don't cut it. It's peer-reviewed publications. So maybe we need to change things within so we get more of our expertise to address these downscale problems. So I'm sure we could talk we had such a good group of panelists. I mean, astounding range of expertise coming from different places. We could be here for hours more, especially as a few of us are academics and we all like talking a lot. But we have to draw this session to a close. I mean, I'd like to thank each one of the panelists. I'd like to thank the British High Commission and the British Council for putting this together. What I would like to say to the participants, they put a variety of questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to those because we had the questions that were registered before, but we will address them. We have your registration details. We'll address them over the next couple of weeks. The other aspect is it will be published and it'll be freely available. The details are forthcoming. They will be, and we'll be able to advertise that through the British Council to everyone. So I'd like to thank everyone for every one of the panelists, Fabrice for giving the additional presentation, Romyen for helping me out with the questions, everyone from the British Council for making this happen, and especially to the participants who listened in today. I'm sure you've got a wealth of information to think about, some action items that you can maybe install in your lives, in your community, in your profession, to try and make the world a safer place. Because we are, as Fred said, we're in a climate emergency. We've had 1 degree C change from pre-industrial. Look how many disasters we have. If we don't do anything about climate change, temperatures will increase 3 to 5 degrees C. How many more climate emergencies will we get? This is important. We all need to act on it. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope to see you all again. Bye-bye.